So this morning I wanted to start and ask a few questions in a different language, just to see who's out there in my audience. And the dialect is a little different, but I think any of you who can understand it would probably be able to know what I'm talking about. So if anybody's out there, just give me a clue. My first question, what makes the grass grow? Anybody know the answer? What makes the flowers bloom? Guts. That is the spirit of the bayonet. What does coonskin and alligator hide make? A good pair of jump boots just the right size. Who is Jody? What is he doing?
He's going to take your woman.
Who Jody is? Jody's that guy back on the block hooking up with your girlfriend while you're away. Why don't you eat charms? Charms don't eat charms. Charms are the candy that you get in your MREs, which is bad luck. You don't eat the charms, you just throw them away. You can always ask somebody if they got a DD-214, if they know what UCMJ is, if they're an 11 Bravo. Sometimes you'll find somebody who's a Charlie Foxtrot. You know what that is? I can't tell you what that is. It's assault. So this is the language of the modern military. And it is a language that is not really spoken by a lot of folks. In North Carolina, there's only about 736,000 veterans in a state of 9.5 million people. In Wake County, we've only got about 53,000 veterans out of a population of 1 million. So it is a language that is not always spoken. Now, I learned it when I joined the U.S. Army Reserves and then the National Guard, serving from 1993 to 1999. The Clinton years. The good years where absolutely nothing was going on. But the language I cannot speak is the language of war, for that very reason. So I enlisted immediately after the first Gulf War, and my enlistment ended just in November of 2011, a month after 9/11. So I had no war to fight. So I cannot really speak to the authority that we have gathered here today to explore. And I would gamble that a few, if any of the presenters during these programs presented, can speak that language. I'd be surprised. And I would contend that only those who have been to war can really speak to that experience. But as us on the outside looking in, we want to try and to translate that experience. But is that possible? If you listen to the Union veteran Oliver Wendell Holmes, when he talked about war, he said, "We have shared the incommunicable experience of war." In his words, war cannot be translated, it cannot be described, it cannot be shared. And that ends my talk today. We hit a wall. So if that is true, our endeavor to sort of have a student-led exhibit is a little pointless. But it is our job as historians, our raison d'etre, to really help society by trying to understand, to make sense of how it has grown, to make sense of war. And museums, they give us that stage to tell that story. We can offer different perspectives, different agendas, different motivations, different opinions, but all drawing a line from the present to the past to try to teach what war is and what war does. So we can only approximate the experience, being outside of that experience. But in our attempt, it is the important process of doing history. So today I kind of want to give you some ideas of how to approach veterans, what makes a good museum exhibit, how can we embody this experience of war in the museum, and just to explore basically the duty of museums. The job of museums as in historians. So I think first and foremost, students must come to understanding war with a critical inquiry. The idea to ask what questions and to understand what questions to ask. And I really think that as we approach this incommunicable experience, that the key to any exhibit rests on understanding what comes out of the mouths of survivors. I think this is the key to any public reflection on war, to talk to those who have experienced it. The words and the thoughts of veterans perhaps the most closest way, the most authentic way museums can teach about war. So today's conversation, I wanted to peel back and dust off my graduate school experience and do a little bit of public history 101. And it's kind of necessary to give a little bit of context to what other museums have done in the past. And certainly with war, you were handling a topic which passions and agendas and perspectives and national truth all kind of combine to make any exhibit on war possibly conflicted and certainly controversial. Now, when we look back in the past how war has been handled in American museums, you have to look no farther than 20 years ago when public historians really got beat up. And the two Smithsonian exhibits I also would call to your attention is one called The West as America at the National Museum of Art in 1991, and especially the Enola Gay exhibit at the National Air and Space Museum in 1995. This is straight up grad school 101, what not to do in this. So at both museums, portions of the audience, media reviewers, and some funders objected strenuously to the interpretation they perceived as unpatriotic, incomplete, and tendentious. The museums, the individual staff, the outside scholars associated with these exhibits suffered damaged credibility, blighted careers, and several years of humiliating attacks in the media and on the floor of the Congress for what this exhibit pulled together. And especially for the Enola Gay, we see a conflict in perspective. When we offer the idea that dropping the atomic bomb on Japan was a great endeavor by the American military to end the war, saving hundreds and thousands of potential GI lives, avoiding the invasion of Japan. But the curators decided to look at the perspective of what is the effect of the atomic bomb, the sort of the suffering of civilians on the ground, and sort of the long-lasting detrimental effects of being underneath an atomic explosion. So, to pardon the pun, it was a firestorm of controversy and conflicting perspectives. Now, this kind of gets back to the museum's institutional strategies for how do they approach these stories. And it is very critical, because museum displays of war are of particular interest not only because they provide evidence of the past wars, but because they often serve to advance national identity, nationalism, and patriotism. Certainly with wars, this is the very core that a lot of these national ideas are wrapped around war. And often they don't really offer really critical reflection of what war means and what war does and the broader impact on society. Most exhibits do not encourage the viewing public to critically consider the value or the meaning of war. And we should always ask with these exhibits, since they are so wrapped around these truths of Americans that we hold firm to our hearts and breast, what agendas do museums having when they talk about it? What are they trying to say? What is their angle? Who is choosing what stories to be told, and who is choosing what artifacts to be shown? This is how the critical thinking students should approach any exhibit, of who is behind the exhibit, and why are they saying what they're saying. And as public historians, we connect with the public all the time. For better or for worse, we have one foot in the academic world of historians and one foot in the public world. And we're always trying to do what we call visitor studies. We're always trying to get into the mind of those viewers, to try to get an idea of what they expect out of museums, what do they want out of museums, and what do they think of museums. It makes us very self-conscious all the time. So we're always trying to predict what the Joneses and the Smiths are thinking about museums. And what we've discovered is that when war exhibits are presented to the public, we always use sort of storyline narratives. We've got a great arc of the beginning of the war, the high point of the war, and the end of the war. And we always use objects to sort of add proof that the war happened. It's stinky uniforms, crusty guns, beat up letters and associated of other OD green components crammed into cases. And so museums, for better or for worse, have always sort of, for simplicity, for their agenda, is to sort of create this great narrative, this sort of narrative of the war. And they draw the public into these overarching historical narratives, often with a narrow perspective. Is it limited by space in the museum? Is it limited by time? Is it limited by money for exhibits? There's always sort of this great story you can take in within 20 minutes and get back to the funnel cakes outside or hitting the gift shop. And so history museums are notorious for this, and people actually expect this when they come to history museums. They envision places where one learns of stories of the nation's progress, the triumph of America, the exceptionalism of America. So this is what we think people want, especially out of war exhibits. They want an appeasing of this unquestioned, feel-good narrative of the past that reaffirms the national identity that only war can really substantially, concretely show to the public. So here's one exhibit that I think really sums up that. It's called the Price of Freedom exhibit, Americans at War at the National Museum of American History. And the museum says that this exhibit surveys the history of America's military from the French and Indian Wars to the present conflict in Iraq, exploring ways in which wars are defining episodes in American history. The exhibition extends far beyond a survey of battles to present the link between military conflict, American political leadership, social values, technological information, and personal sacrifice. The heart of the story is the impact of war on citizens, their families, and communities. I know, it kind of bores me a little bit. What do you think? So here's one a little bit more in sort of this great tradition of celebrating America and the fighting men and women who served her. The National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Virginia. They say that their mission is to, quote, honor the 8 million Americans who served in the war against Japan and the more than 100,000 who gave their lives, that we believe that this is the best way to honor them is to truthfully and respectfully tell the stories of their struggles, their sacrifices, their triumphs, so future generations may learn the price of freedom. Can you see an agenda in that mission statement a little bit? Kind of, sort of. Now, me being a Civil War guy in the 19th century, the other museum I'm going to bring up is the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The only time I've been to the museum is when I snuck in a side door that I saw, as you are, and went in. It was so greatly affected by some of the displays, which were kind of gory. They were covered in mannequins and great poses, covered in dripping fake blood. If you're up in Harrisburg, I would advise you to pop in to see this museum. And so even in this, their mission statement, understanding the world of Civil War interpretation, this is a little loaded as well. So this is from their website. They say that the only museum in the United States that portrays the entire story of the American Civil War. History is preserved in equally balanced presentations that are humanistic in nature without bias to Union or Confederate causes. A museum that promises to tell the balanced story. You see what's a little wrong with that? That certainly they have not gone with an overarching narrative. They have sort of, that is code for they are appeasing their neo-Confederate side to show both sides in equity, which many neo-Confederates make such a grand argument that the truth of their cause is still not being shown in museums. So I thought that was very interesting to see that they went out of their way to say they're showing balanced, and that they are sort of showing both sides of this story. But lately, scholars have really started to turn away from this idea of this overarching narrative, because I think it really sells people short, it sells the public short. And it does not open the door for that critical discussion that we need to have in the public history field. With a collective national identity presented through historical events, it ignores a lot of the moral issues, and you can't think of a topic much more wrapped in morality than the issue of war. And so what we're starting to see is sort of a pluralistic view of interpretation of the war and presentation of that story in museums. And museums are starting to present more of a plural or a critical view of the past. And what this does, though, it really brings it into conflict with a lot of these entrenched national ideas that we have about who we are and what America is. And out of that is going to come resistance, controversy, and discord. As we question war, really the coat hook that we hang the mantle of American identity on is being called into question. So that ruffles feathers. Certainly, the Enola Gay exhibit is essential to addresses that exact story. So, at the City of Raleigh Museum that I run, we've run into this as well. We currently have an exhibit on the struggle for the civil rights in Raleigh, called Long Road to Civil Rights. And you can go right now to our fabulous Facebook page and read this comment by a fellow named Jason Forehand. If he's in here, I would like to talk to you after. So he writes on our Facebook page after visiting the museum, says, Raleigh has fallen victim to the PC crowd. What will your children learn, he asked, that Raleigh was founded by slave owners and that there was segregation in the Jim Crow South and Raleigh was no different? There is nothing, all caps, uplifting here. This museum is a disgrace. So you see, for him, there's nothing uplifting. That the idea of success of the civil rights movement in Raleigh is not an uplifting story. So what we present in our history does not coincide with what he thinks is an uplifting narrative to tell the history of Raleigh. So again, that's different perspectives on the same topic and subject. We had another visitor who was upset by the civil rights exhibit. So certainly with events in the past 3 to 4 years, our civil rights exhibit is being viewed differently than the public. Because it's been up there for 8 years. So it's been there. The public has seen it. But now with this sort of new perspective people are coming to it, we had a guy walk in several weeks ago, saw our civil rights exhibit, and saw the sort of broad pronouncement of our 2 segregated doors we have. We have the colored waiting room and the white waiting room doors. And he turned around and marched out and was yelling that, why are we showing such divisive exhibits when we all need to come together? I thought that was pretty interesting. That this sort of celebratory exhibit is now being perceived as a divisive exhibit by the public, by a white public, I should say. But in this unsettling, there is the opportunity to talk, to discuss, to delve deeper into who we are and what the past means to us. I think the strength of the exhibit, student-led exhibit, lies in the questions the exhibit curators ask, the multiple voices they share, and the answers they provide, the queries, the prompts that they give visitors to have these crucial conversations. And especially when dealing with armed conflict, critical thinking and thoughtful exhibits ignite the public's interest. It ignites an idea. It sparks that conversation, which ultimately we in the museum world want to do now. It's not for our voices to tell you what history is, to provide the setting, the facts, and have you discuss and make up your own interpretations of the past. So certainly we can move from the battlefield to start talking about breaching the topic of the war's cost and its effects. And this does not fit, as I said earlier, into the public's perceptions for its desire for those battlefield maps and those old stinky uniforms and the racks of guns that we believe that people want. But it forces them to sort of recalibrate their intersection with war and through exhibits. And what this does, not only for the public, but for the museums, is also important. Because it changes the space, the physical space in the museum. So what I mean by this is that museums not only become, we move from the place where we are having a one-sided conversation with the public. We are telling you history. We now create a space where history organically is discussed. If that makes sense. We want these conversations so people can share these different perspectives. They can share these different experiences. And so not us telling you this experience of this veteran, that you may be in the exhibit with a veteran and hear his experience and get a better understanding of this exhibit that we cannot communicate. And furthermore, having this unique organic conversation space, it ultimately shifts the museum from a didactic, one-sided display space to this conversation space. So ultimately, we become part of the community. We become part of the community. We are part of the community conversations. We have some role in to help shape the community's future. So this takes us from being a relic of the community to being a part of it. And I hope that makes sense to sort of say that to make museums relevant, to keep up funders, to keep people coming in the door, we must be a part of that community. So now we have sort of a general idea of how to critically think and approach exhibits. It's time to turn to sort of think about sort of the meat of the exhibit, the evidence, the interpretive direction, the interpretive tactics of how to sort of tell this history. And again, when we do these visitor studies, people take these wonderful surveys in the door and we bore them to death with all these questions about how they interact with the exhibit. We find that people have expectations when they come to the museum to learn, but not to feel. To feel. We at museums have sort of stripped so much of the human story and the exciting stories and the passion stories out of history. We've all boiled it down to names, dates, and facts. And certainly that is a product of how we teach history today. But people come, they don't think about feeling history, which is something that I think that we can really latch onto for a student-led exhibit and make. And you can't look at any more topic in the human experience that is more passion than war. But so many museums, when you go there and you see these cases stacked with artifacts, because war relics are so easy to put your hands on. There's collections are crammed full with uniforms, buttons, bullets, daggers, swords, letters, handkerchiefs, you name it, associated with war. When you go into these exhibits from now on, look how much the emphasis on material culture takes away from the real story that you are trying to communicate to the public. And the simple question is, how much interpretive power, how much emotional power does a helmet convey to the public? Convey to the public who has never worn one. Convey to the public who doesn't really sometimes know what type of military equipment they're looking at. How much weight does that give to your exhibit to try to communicate this incommunicable experience? But this is museums what we do. We use material culture to convey these ideas. But I would argue that even going past using relics is pretty important. It's almost crucial. And I think for the student-led exhibit, for any exhibit, especially with wars, we go into the 21st century, coming out of the two longest wars in American history, that the true artifacts that are at your fingertips to discover and to utilize, again, are the voices of those who had experienced the war. And often, exhibits do include these voices, but in the sea of artifacts, in the sea of graphs, charts, photographs, the distractions of cool stuff, these words, the emotional power that these selections were actually put in the exhibit to convey are ultimately lost. But they are this real strength. These are the words of the survivors. And they are not meant to give a comprehensive, overarching narrative of the war, of a campaign or a battle, but it is an individual's confession of what they saw, what they felt, what they smelled, and how they came back home. It is authenticity in its most truest sense. So when we start to look at sort of using these voices, talking to veterans is perhaps one of the most important and tricky aspects to an exhibit. And the key to this model is understanding how to talk to veterans and the ability to communicate with them. bit of my veteran language earlier, but historians should realize the value in oral histories, and to understand how to conduct these interviews is fairly important and tricky for veterans. Eager historians must remember how America has treated veterans in the past, and more importantly, the person they are talking to has lived through an incredible experience. And even starting back with the American Revolution, veterans looked at their return home and looked at the people around them and realized they are different. Even to this day, veterans will come back and say, how can I relate to people who do not know what I have lived through? And I would strongly suggest that a quick survey of veterans, study of veterans who have come back from wars, and even just a dip into the idea of understanding post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, moral injury, are some topics that could really help understand and give students some perspective on what the veterans' experience exactly is. And it would certainly give some insight into those unseen wounds that veterans carry on their bodies and their minds. But it is, for us on the outside trying to get in, is the thin line, especially talking to veterans. It is such a thin line between investigative historian and inappropriate interloper. We have to walk that fine line. And there are lists out there that you go online for questions you do not ask ask veterans when they return. Don't ask them if they killed anybody. Don't ask them, was it hard to leave your family back home? So there are some very nuanced approaches to talking to veterans, but at the same time, we as historians want to really get to those kernels, those sort of painful kernels that could help us teach about that experience. But at some point, we have to understand that those experiences that we want to get at and share with the public, to really convince the public, to teach the public of this experience, those experiences may be too deeply disturbing, pushed down too deep in veterans' bodies, and too locked away for them to share. So when we did our exhibit at the City of Raleigh Museum, we interviewed World War II veterans. And it was very curious what they said to us when we talked about their experience over 70 years ago. But what we also found is that it was more interesting what they did not say to us, which was also just as curious. And then certainly, with our multiracial interviews, who would say what to who? It's always part of that consideration. And you can tell by the time we interview these World War II veterans, they have had a lifetime of answering questions from the public. And so they sort of would easily be able to reel off what memories they were willing to share and places they would not go. They had already compartmentalized all these memories and tucked them away. So we got access to those that they were willing to share with us. So the exhibit that we crafted at the Raleigh City Museum is called Our Voices, Our War, Voices of Raleigh's World War II Veterans. And I kind of want to give you a little bit of thought processes as I developed this exhibit, and kind of hopefully use that as a test case to sort of put some of these ideas that I've been talking about into physical space and into fabrication. So when I arrived in Raleigh, the City of Raleigh Museum in 2012, I kind of surveyed the expansive Cities, Parks, and Recs department. And I noticed in Southeast Raleigh there was a community center called Sergeant Courtney Johnson Community Center. And I was like, that's interesting. Who is Sergeant Johnson? So I raced down to this community center, and I got there, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing to tell me who this person was, except for a single, unlabeled photograph of a young black Marine on the wall of this community center. And I said, well, that's a damn shame. So I decided somehow to make plans to put up a pop-up exhibit there, or some type of something to tell who this young man was, who was killed in a mortar attack in 2007 in Iraq, who had actually worked at the center before he was sent off to the war. So to give his life some context, what I started doing is to looking at Raleigh's African-American community, going back to the earliest veterans to sort of show the trajectory of the black experience of war so I could drop his life into this greater meaning. So we started by interviewing black World War II veterans. And as we started going through this exhibit, I found that it sort of ran counter to this greatest generation narrative that we sort of heard about, this greatest generation, which Tom Brokaw has turned into a marble pillar of our understanding of World War II. And then I started to look at interviewing white veterans and sort of setting them beside this narrative of the black soldiers. And so you see these two narratives about the same experience running through. Now, I did not stop at their war experience. I was very curious back, as these veterans, at the end of their lives, how did the war cast its long shadow throughout their lives? How did that war experience stay with them? How did it reverberate? So we went on after the war. Housing, education. We looked at how the military experience of black soldiers going to a non-segregated Europe, access to education, the GI Bill, set them up to be foot soldiers of the civil rights movement when they returned. This was a narrative that is not in our, we've been told about white GIs coming back, starting the nuclear family in the suburbs, going off to build America after that. So it was certainly a very different experience. And I sort of tried to highlight this in a number of ways. I had a digital picture frame where I just had a scrapbook of a white GI just flipping through. So you could see his doodles and cartoons of sergeants and all of his letters he put in. So it's a very intimate portrait of his experience. Now on the other side of it, I took another picture frame and just downloaded pictures taken by black GIs. I just kind of roll through their typical GIs, joking around, posing on tanks, just GI pictures. And then you would run across images of them with their arms around their white German girlfriends. An incredible photograph, an incredible experience that would have got you killed in the American South in the 1940s for doing that. So it was this very powerful dichotomy of these. And I blew the pictures up of these veterans larger than life, and to put pictures of them as throughout their lives. So we actually end the exhibit with these large pictures of veterans who are taking the honor flights where they would fly veterans up to DC to see the World War II monument. Because I feel that coming face to face and looking into the eyes of the veteran, of that person, creates this humanity connection. And so we opened the exhibit on the 70th anniversary of D-Day, and a lot of the veterans came back in. And I think many of them knew that it was sort of their last huzzah, and they were very appreciative that we would take the time to look back and tell their story. But I think students at Wake Tech and us today have a unique opportunity, because in many of your classes, many of your students' classmates, your neighbors, your grocery clerks, are veterans who have come back from this war, and that experience is fresh in their mind, fresh in their memories, and still fresh in their hearts. And I think that we've got some new tools to help us understand this veteran story that is unique to 2016, the first half of the 21st century. And these tools can really help the public envision what that experience is. And it comes from a long lineage, starting back with Matthew Brady and his dead, images of the dead at Antietam. Furthered by the newsreels and movies of Frank Capra in World War II. Why We Fight newsreels. It's a continuing legacy of the Vietnam TV crews who came back and presented graphic images of soldiers fighting in Vietnam in the evening news. And through the internet, social media, and especially YouTube, we now have unprecedented access to that war experience. We can now access the fighting in Fallujah, riding in a Humvee, getting blown up in Ramadi, or killing insurgents by air in Baghdad. Multiple videos available 24 hours a day and limited to only as much as we can stomach. So we can be there, we can see it. Anytime we need to go find war, is there at our fingertips. And it is just as what one New York Times reporter claimed that Matthew Brady did when he presented these Antietam images that shocked so much of the public who saw them. He said, "Mr. Brady has done something to bring home to us the terrible reality and earnestness of war. If he has not brought the bodies and laid them in our dooryards and along our streets, he has done something very like it." Now every soldier with a smartphone or video camera can document his war and share it globally. So, to push it one step further, we've talked about the authenticity of the veteran's voice. We've talked about how to shift changing perspectives in the museum, how to think critically. And I think sort of the newest frontier to push is to actually give those veterans, to hand over the reins of that curatorial responsibility. What would veterans say about their own experiences if they could tell us? So besides telling us and having these curators go in and mesh it up and spit it back out, what about the veterans design the exhibit? And there are several museums that are doing that. One I found particularly interesting is an exhibit called From War to Home. And it's an art exhibit at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And the exhibit sort of explores to stimulate the dialogue and build bridges between veterans and those who wish to welcome them home. Veterans of all service eras will recognize their own experiences and perspectives in these photographic narratives, I should say, while members of the community will gain a deeper understanding of the personal collective cost of war. That is sort of the project director's view and hope for this exhibit. And perhaps the most interesting one is the National Veterans Art Museum in Chicago, Illinois. And I found this to be pretty interesting. And they have this lofty goal. They state that their mission is to bridge the gap between perception and the reality of combat. The National Veterans Art Museum offers a place where all can experience combat-inspired art. It provides both a physical and emotional space for veterans and civilians of all ages to come and gain a new appreciation for how the split-second decisions made in combat can impact a lifetime. The artwork showcased provides a unique perspective on the controversial subject of war to all. It's a tenuous and reflective balance of beauty and horror, providing unique insight into the psyche of combat veterans and the consequential impact of war leaves on survivors. Sounds like a pretty interesting museum. And again, they're using art that's subjective, medium, to somehow give it to veterans to translate that incommunicable experience. So use art. But when I checked on the staff at the museum, none of them are veterans. Is that important? Maybe, maybe not. So in closing, I kind of wanted to wrap up and summarize a few of the points. I think students should come into this exhibit having a well-rounded understanding of the general history in the area on which they're stepping off into. And they need to understand that they have to ask critical questions. Questions that may be painful, may be controversial, but will ultimately further the interpretive power of an exhibit. And we must reach out to talk to those who lived through war. Listen to them, let them correct you, and be astute to follow their leads when they point you in another direction that does not line up in your initial preconceptions of the exhibit that you want to tell. Let them guide the direction. Let their words tell your story, because it is hard to argue with those who have seen, felt, and continue to live with the sublime experience of war. So thank you very much for listening in this morning.